Okay, so I don't really have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm kind of weird. I just don't. I used to spend a lot of time making PowerPoint presentations, but nowadays I just prefer to speak and focus on the actual people before me. And I don't feel particularly well prepared. But initially, I kind of anticipated this would be a much easier load than it turned out to be. So I'm going to focus on some of the aspects which I found particularly interesting to me and which I find very interesting for discussion. And some of the more difficult bits, which I admit at some points flew over my head, we can probably touch upon better in the discussion part. Um, but I suppose I can actually begin the what is it? The fifth chapter actually begins with a topic which I find very interesting, which I think is very much pertinent, and that's this interesting comparison of a faith in God, of this theological faith, with a faith in mechanicism, to how Whitehead kind of compares, and he also spoke about this in previous chapters, where he says that in a certain way we've gone from looking for reason in faith and to having faith in reason, and I think that's a very interesting point to make, and very much touches upon some of the topics which I suppose in this epidemic we've also been talking about. Something I was thinking about in relation to this is that, for example, in relation to the vaccines, to get very current immediately, in relation to the vaccines, we're often encouraged to put faith into science, to trust science. And I think this is a very interesting and possibly problematic approach to kind of justifying science, to justifying scientifically sound decisions, and something that maybe we should be more careful about, because from my point of view, and I think given the general philosophy of science, it's the the virtue of science is not that you have to put faith into it, but it's because it's it's a system. In a kind of way objective system which we can use to explain the world to ourselves, to work, to act in a certain world, rather than just kind of assume it's right and do its bidding in a kind of religious fashion. And I think this is a very interesting point, which sort of Whitehead opens up here. He doesn't really work through it in this particular direction, which I'm trying to take here. But something I think we could discuss at a later point. This one other claim in this particular paragraph, which I found interesting, is when Whitehead says that this scientific scheme of explaining the world has, in a certain way, lasted longer than the theological scheme. And I'm not quite sure if I misunderstood this, or if what particular sense to understand this in, because I don't feel it's factually correct, because the theological scheme has been with us for a very, very long time, even before the Greeks. And this scientific worldview has emerged quite recently. So it seems interesting that in this paragraph he kind of implies that the scientific scheme has lasted longer. We don't really know how long it's going to last, and in certain senses, as I was talking about, we are already theologizing science in certain manners. So it's questionable how long lasting this scheme actually is, and if it's really consistent all the way through. The second very interesting theme, which Whitehead seems to theme, or I suppose tool, which Whitehead resorts to over and over, are these literary references, and where he claims that it is in literature that a concrete outlook of humanity receives its expression, the inward thoughts of a generation. And this is something that I've always been pretty interested in. I think the Germans call this something like Geistgeschichte, in a certain sense that it's a sense of history, which is not really like the empirical kind of history, which we, I suppose, learn in in schools, but it's not empirical facts. It's not just the, I don't know, sociological facts, but it's this wider scheme of humanity, these wider expressions of humanity, of the human spirit, which we should study in this context. And it's in literature, which I suppose kind of has this, it's a kind of sediment of this spirit. And I find Whitehead to be very much reminiscent of Hegel in this sense. And I'm not sure how much Hegel he ever read, how much he liked him or disliked him. But I feel like he often recurs to this notion of the spirit of the age, of the spirit of the thinkers, of thought. So maybe this is another interesting avenue to explore, especially those people who know, like Matt, how much contact with Hegel did Whitehead really have. But yeah, what the thing that gets expressed in this literary form, in this spirit, in the 19th century, in this romantic reaction which Whitehead is talking about, is the tension between, on the one hand, scientific realism and the mechanicist view of reality, and on the other hand, this idea that humans are still, or organisms in general, are still to a certain degree self-determining organisms. And this is something which the poets seem to be particularly attuned to feeling, this tension, this dichotomy, how to put these two different views together. But the thing that seems to happen, as Whitehead goes on, with these tensions is that we sort of just assume certain things, we presume certain things, we take certain postulates which may be more or less arbitrary, and sort of stick to them. And there's this interesting thought that this is not something that, for example, the medieval philosophers allowed themselves to have to kind of accept certain uncertainties at some place of their level, to accept certain starting points and just build on that and ignore their potential uncertainty. And because they always sought to have this kind of complete harmonic whole picture of whole system. On the other hand, modern science in a very wide sense, seems to just accept certain uncertainties and just keep driving this bulldozer of science onward to greater or lesser success. But of course, ignoring certain difficulties which are underlying this process, this exploration. So yeah, basically the core part of this chapter is Whitehead trying to trace the development of the different views of this tension, how it manifested itself in different poets, different thinkers, I suppose. And he starts, for example, with Milton, and which we've touched upon in the first session, which is very interesting. Yeah, how things are connecting. And then Pope, and then Wordsworth, and he finishes with Tennyson. And they have, you actually have this very interesting line of development. For example, in Milton, there is still this kind of faith in theology. We can still explain the world in a certain way, in a certain way, or actually it's explained through God. Pope already knows that this explanation is going to be very complex, that this maze we are thrown into is very difficult to navigate, but there is still hope that we can do this ultimately. Whereas with Wordsworth, we have a certain we have an emergence of a strong doubt in the possibility or even in the desirability of being able to resolve this maze. And there's this fear that in doing so, we are losing something essential about the maze, about nature. Let's see. Yeah, there's a big bit of back and forth here, so let me see how to organize this better. Basically, in Tennyson, he sees this tension between determinism again, between mechanicism and his free will, which Tennyson himself doesn't really articulate very clearly. He is just sort of felt in what he's writing. Yeah, how Whitehead basically finishes this bit about Tennyson is that what he wants to say is that either, like Tennyson says, the stars, she whispers blindly run, but Whitehead wants to answer that we can't just accept sort of a compromise between indeterminism and say, and he says that either the bodily molecules blindly run or they do not. So it's the compromise is not particularly convincing to him. That, for example, John Stuart Mill suggested, and nor is like for most thinkers in that period, also Plessner, if I may name drop, nor is vitalism an acceptable solution. What Whitehead wants to do instead is to replace this entire materialistic, mechanistic view with a more organismic view of reality, of presenting things rather than just specific separate bits of matter as yeah, I'm not doing so well at this. Essentially what he's saying is that the plan of the whole influences the very characters of the various subordinate organisms which enter into this whole. So in a certain sense, how I understand his very general point is that we have to start looking at phenomena not as static pieces of matter, but as processes, as events, as things which are very much intertangled with their contexts, with other events, and interfused with them. And this is how I understand what he calls his organic, is it organic or organicistic mechanicism. So to quote, the molecule may blindly run in accordance with the general laws, but the molecules differ in their intrinsic characters according to the general organic plans of the situations in which they find themselves. And then, of course, after this this bit, he returns to Wordsworth and tries to point out in Wordsworth's work this tension, which I began with in describing. Basically already covered this bit. And yeah, on the one hand, you have the Wordsworth, this fear that to dissect, that we murder to dissect. And I think this is, again, a very interesting idea, which I personally find very much relatable. It's something I've experienced, for example, throughout cognitive science, that you take some kind of an object, for example, human cognition, to study it, but in a certain sense, you lose sight of the, I personally lost sight of the thing I wanted to study for human cognition. So you take it as some kind of an isolated system, as kind of a computer, and in a certain sense, it loses touch with reality. It loses touch with the immediacy of the real phenomenon. And this is something that Wordsworth also very much feared, and he wanted to view nature in this, what he says, this haunting presence of nature, in this this wholeness of the experience of nature, rather than just taking it apart into these bits of matter which are analyzed in a narrow scientific method, which is something that, for example, Shelley, later who followed after him, didn't share. And I'm not quite sure how to understand. I'd have to read Shelley's poetry, because he seems to have this interesting, on the one hand, positive relationship to science. He's very much in favor of science. Science permeates the way he even writes his poetry, the imagery he uses, the metaphors he uses. But on the other hand, he doesn't seem to lose sight of the inward character of nature, of these aspects which Wordsworth thought that science necessarily distorted in a certain way. Now, another topic which we also, I think, figured in one of the previous chapters is the role of philosophy in dealing with these tensions, in dealing with the presumptions and the abstractions which lie underneath our current worldview. And the question is, so what is philosophy doing in regards to this? And Whitehead's view is that on the one hand, philosophy is harmonizing the various abstractions, the presumptions, the ideas which build up our worldview, and assigns to them, he says, their right relative status. And on the other hand, it completes them by comparing them with our concrete intuitions of the world. So it seems to have this, in a way, synthetic, holistic work of trying to put things together, comparing them, and trying to find their interconnections, their mutual tensions. And he says, philosophy is not one among the sciences with its own little scheme of abstractions, which it works away at perfecting and improving. It is the survey of sciences with a special object of their harmony and of their completion. It brings to this task not only the evidence of the separate sciences, but also its own appeal to concrete experience. It confronts the sciences with concrete fact. And I think this is something very interesting from a metaphilosophical view. It's something which it seems to just do on the side to mention what this work of philosophy, at least in this context. But I think it's something which we could very much discuss, and I think it's very much pertinent in the current climate to ask ourselves, what is philosophy really doing? Are we just arguing about who said what, or are we actually trying to be connected with what's going on in the spirit of the age, in the spirit of humanity? Are we dealing with real problems, or are we just caught up in a text? This is something which I think is very much a relevant point. And in a similar way, literature is also relevant because, like I said in the beginning, literature is the sediment of the, I don't know, problems of the things happening in humanity at a certain given point in history, and it can tell us a lot about what is going on, and it's where I suppose philosophy, in a certain sense, can draw inspiration for its further exploration. And it's, yeah, there's this notion of values, which this brooding presence of the whole onto its various parts, which Whitehead talks about, which literature, which poets are very good at, in a certain way embodying in a certain work of art, and which I suppose in the scientific view sometimes gets obscured, unlike in, for example, literature. There's this part where he contrasts, on the one hand, the dichotomy of subjectivism versus objectivism, and on the other hand, idealism versus realism, which are not, as he presents them, really separate, are not the same kind of dichotomies. But in short, he says that he settles for a kind of provisional realism, in which there is this objective material world which we can sort of gain access to, rather than be in a certain way caught up in a kind of solipsistic idealism, which he does not put much faith into, for various reasons, which I'm not going to go into now. There's this bit where he talks about the role of the body, and on the one hand, he's not in favor of the idea that the body is all there is to explaining, for example, some kind of I don't know, mental functioning, but on the other hand, admitting that the body is regulating our cognitive functioning. And this I found very much reminiscent of the inactivist emphasis on embodied cognition. This is something I think could be interesting to compare as well. Yeah, let me skip ahead because I've already been very much rambling. as he moves on to the next century, he sees these three main sources, main influences. On the one hand, you had the Romantic movement. On the other hand, you have this rise of science. And there's also the rise of technology, which is not only of intellectual interest, but very much practically, materially changes the everyday life of people. The thing he points out in relation to technology is that the 19th century wasn't so interesting just because it invented all sorts of gadgets, because it invented the very process of invention, of the process of moving from the scientific ideas to products. And he sees that the nation, which is particularly good at polishing this process, at professionalizing it, were the Germans. On the other hand, he has this interesting quote, which maybe it's also reminiscent of Milton again, where he says that man who at times dreamt of himself as a little lower than the angels has submitted to become the servant and the minister of nature. It still remains to be seen whether the same actor can play both parts. I think that's a very much, I don't know, Faustian question that we can touch upon as well. He says he's going to touch upon some negative social effects of science as well, but this is not really the topic of this chapter. He then presents these four key ideas which have shaped which shape the spirit of this particular age. It is first of all this idea that physical activity pervades all space. Then there's this idea that of atomicity, which had already appeared before in history, for example, with the Greeks, Democritus, and so forth. But it's an idea which was back then sort of one of the many ideas, one of the many streams, and not particularly the primary stream at the time. But now it became sort of solidified in various sciences, even in biology. You had this notion of the basic atom, for example, the cell in the biological world. And he says that what happens is that the astronomers had shown us how big the universe is. Meanwhile, the chemists and biologists teach us how small it is. And this is a very important idea, which finds. And then the third idea is the idea that underneath all change, there are certain quantitative permanences. And then the idea of evolution, that new organisms, new things in nature are basically kind of result of chance. An interesting thing that he finds to happen in the 19th century is that you begin with this great scientific optimism, this idea, this belief that we are basically on the verge of solving all the important questions, and a lot of scientists being very much adamant about solving all kinds of questions with these methodologies which were developing up to that point. But then there is what he finds another period of certain dullness which follows this spirit of optimism. This although science continues to progress, continues to invent things and improve things, he thinks that this a kind of a dullness similar to what he found in the Enlightenment reemerged, which, as he says about the Enlightenment, it was not really looking for new ideas for the new next steps, but essentially just applying the systems which it had built up to that point to new phenomena, and in a certain way ignoring the ever greater inconsistencies which lay underneath, which are kind of captured in also the literature which I talked about. Eventually this is kind of dubbed in the dominant view, this scientific materialism finds its place into science itself, into the very notion of matter, into the very which gets slowly replaced with more dynamic notions, with the notions of energy, of fields. But at this point, it doesn't really go anywhere. And for example, the biology is an example of science which at that point basically tried to mimic what physics was doing. And it was only in the, I suppose, it was in the early 20th century where this problem that biology, we cannot apply this mathematical physicist approach to biology became really prominent with various thinkers which dealt with the kind of the philosophy of life, the philosophy of nature. His suggestion, as I've sort of sketched in the previous chapter, which he had sketched in the previous chapter, and now continues, is this organismic view of understanding reality, of understanding the building blocks in the process of reality, rather than seeing really things as separate things, seeing them as interconnected, as contextualized, and in constant relationships with other organisms, or in his the language he uses at this point, with other events. Every event is again interfused with other events. You can't look at an event just in isolation by itself. Now, quite frankly, he goes into, like, on pages 104 and 5 into this explanation of his view of what an event is to him. But I didn't get this, and I think it would be better than me trying to struggle through it, and better if we just discuss this later on. It's basically an explanation of how he understands what is it really that an event presents for him. The other points which are left in the chapter are things I've sort of already mentioned. Is that is this, I suppose, what we could say, embeddedness of the entities of these organisms, of these events, and in certain environments environments which are constantly affecting the entities which we're studying, which I suppose is very much in line with modern physics that I were developing at the point he was writing this. Yeah, and he also develops, I suppose, in doing this, he develops a similar view of evolution than in an activism, or for example, not in activism, but for example, Varela and Maturana. Yeah, and also the body mind, where you have this notion of natural drift, which is this much more flexible view of the relationship between the environment and the organism, or constantly affecting each other and creating each other, rather than the more taught view of classical Darwinism, where you have just this environment into which the organism is parachuted, and then he basically has to fight for his survival. In this view, the relationship is much more flexible. He particularly wants to emphasize this point of the creativity of this process of the relationship between the environment and the organism. And he even says an idea very similar to something I'm not sure in which exact book Varela suggests this. Maybe it's the Tree of Knowledge, that the organisms can create their own environment. And this is something else that maybe someone could find interesting to discuss. So yeah, I've skipped a lot of the things which I found very difficult to mull through. I'm sorry, but I think that through discussion we can come closer to some of the points Whitehead has raised in these two chapters. I hope this wasn't a complete mess.
And valuable things, but in general, I think that it is important that we are kind of a bit more structured and a bit more focused. Anyway, would anybody like to open up a discussion with a topic or a question? Yeah, Matthias.
Yes, I have several questions. I think I felt similar to Primož. There were many things I could follow quite easily, but the central points where Whitehead is developing his philosophy, where I got a sense what he's talking about, but it wasn't entirely clear to me. And there's some things. One is that like how he defines organisms seems way wider, more extensive than you're used to, because protons, electrons are also organisms, the smallest organisms, which is like, that's new, So I would like to maybe look into this. And then so these are just things that I did not understand, or that I couldn't follow. So it's not really, it's just questions. The second one was about the eternal objects. And here I have maybe a more clear question. One is, what are they exactly? He gives these examples like color. It's like, how is that an eternal object? This is usually what most people would say. This is an accidental property. You have the essence, and then you have the properties, and color is a property. So that's baffling as well, like how he talks about organism, how he talks about eternal objects. And then these eternal objects are something that are part of, they're almost like the building blocks of nature. They're not, without them, nature isn't perceptible, experienceable, or something like this. So it's quite baffling. Like, this part was very, very baffling to me. And he also talks in the context of eternal objects about intrinsic essences. And at the same time, the way he talks about events and what entities are, organisms are, it's very contextual, very process oriented. So I don't, like, as a Buddhist, somebody who reads way too much Prasangika and Madhyamaka philosophy, I'm like, intrinsic essences, eternal objects, and processes, how do they go together? Like, he must mean something different with an essence than most. It's not what Descartes thought of. When Descartes says an essence, is something that is self-reliant, that gives itself grounding, doesn't need anything else to be grounded. He doesn't speak like that at all, at least in my understanding. So it's just, this was a little bit difficult. And then also, that all plays together. Then you have these individual events that, like Primož mentioned, they are determined from the past, they determine the future. They also are mirroring the whole universe in a way. So how is this all fitting together? Like, there's these bits of information of Whiteheadian philosophy, and I could not get a coherent picture. I didn't manage. I would have to read it many, many more times. Like, these parts, they were quite difficult. So enlighten me, please.
I would just like to add something here, because it's directly related to what Matthias was asking. And I think that there will be a lot of strain today on Matt and Miha, because they're most well versed in Whiteheadian philosophy. So maybe we could start with the first question. And it's interesting, Matthias, that most of the things that you mentioned are also on my list of questions. So the eternal objects and the organisms all the way down, so to speak. So if we start with the first question about the organisms all the way down, the question I have here is it just me, or so was it just my impression that he doesn't really expound this idea cogently and comprehensively in this particular part? Because there seems to be a very shift movement from where he says, for instance, things like, where he talks about the body and perspectivity, and how you basically I'm still weak on the terminology. But when he uses, say, the human body as a prototype of explaining how this confluence comes about and why it happens, because you have this double coming together, the real coming together of various patterns, so the patterns of aspects from the inside and the outside, so to speak, where, you know, in the lived body, in the event, you actually have the confluence of external aspects, and also in the world, you know, the world also brings about the confluence of the bodily aspect, so to speak. And, you know, you can follow this. You have a pretty clear idea what this is about, that there's a certain co-implication there. But then he moves this on a very fundamental level. And he says that there's basically a fundamentally identical structure on the level of atoms and electrons and so on and so forth. And it would seem to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe again, I haven't noticed, but he doesn't really develop a well-grounded argument at this point for this. I have the impression that the way he presents things, it's more exploratory. So he's kind of putting forward various bits and pieces of his alternative worldview without necessarily providing a rigorous, well-developed argument for this. And I was just curious whether this is something that he then postpones to process and reality. Is this where one finds this idea being developed? Because you have certain glimmers of why this might be, but they're not really explicated. That's the point I'm trying to kind of make. And this is also the reason why I think that also Primož found this baffling, Matthias found this baffling, and I also found it baffling. Not necessarily baffling, but you can sense certain gaps or lacunae in the way he develops these ideas. You know, there's a certain jump where if you don't really know your Whitehead from other works, you know, you don't really see, well, how the heck did this just happen, right? Miha seems to wants to intervene here, and then Hridija.
I think the confusion you're mentioning, Sebastjan, I guess partially stems from Whitehead not yet, right, going into detail as to what are societies, let's say, of entities, right? Because let's say if we're talking about, I guess, a person, right, to which I guess he's also calling attention to when he's talking about look at your immediate present experience, right? The way that is structured is different from the way that the jumbled up experiences of, let's say, a rock are formed. A rock for Whitehead will be something that he'll call a enduring, no, not a corpuscular society or something like that. I think it's in process and reality, right? So you have all these individual, right, actual occasions building it up, but together they don't build up to a new occasional experience, right? As opposed to a human being where all those individual atoms, let's say, and then molecules and organs and of course cells and so on, build up to what is then called later on in processing reality living person, right? So it is a distinct occasion, which is different, right? Something new, I guess. And I guess the confusion here partially stems from this because you don't really know exactly, is there a difference between, I guess, the experiences of an atom and I guess my experience, right? And partially there's also this confusion with, I mean, this is what I firstly confused myself actually when I, well, the first time I read Science in One World, I somehow read it too fast really, and I actually misread when he's saying enduring object and eternal object, right? There's a big difference between the two, right? Enduring objects are the, right, electrons and so on, right? Those minimal, I guess, organisms. And they're enduring because the way they inherit from one another in this, I guess, temporal sequence is such that they just don't change, right? They inherit everything from the past and well, put it onto the future or whatever, right? As opposed to, I guess, organisms in this biological sense of the word, right? Which they, I mean, we can say, of course, they inherit something from the past, but then again, a lot changes and they decay and die away. But the funny thing for me always was that Whitehead's notion of organisms is such that you can talk about something as absurd, right, as such an enduring organism as an electron, which is so enduring that it's probably even redundant to even mention it, right? I mean, it endures through millennia, right? Um, uh, as opposed to, I guess, a human being, right? And I guess when it comes to I want to make an additional point, I guess, to the eternal objects, and I'm struggling here as well myself. I mean, to this day, right? How to correctly go about eternal objects, even when with his later thought, I suppose. But I guess the confusion here is, well, I guess to be expected in a way, which is something I think Gaborin mentioned during Matthew in our last discussion. Like, he's still developing, right, all these notions here. So any confusion here is actually on Whitehead's part as well, I think. And just an additional point as to the eternal objects. I mean, this is the way I try to understand them. In it partially has to do with something Whitehead mentions in those extensive lists of categories and process in reality. And I don't know, is it, I forget what the exact name of the category is, but there's this notion of that everything has to be somewhere for Whitehead, right? Even things such as, even things that we would naturally, I guess, put into the sphere of ideality, right? It has to be somewhere. It's not a realm that's nowhere, right? It has to be somehow, somewhere, right? And I hopefully that partially answered the question, why eternal objects, right? Because he doesn't want to succumb to the problem of, well, here we have these actual occasions and whatnot, but then we have like this sphere of ideality that actually doesn't exist anywhere, but it's actually there influencing everything. It's a bit complicated, right? That there's an interplay between the two, and something like that. I don't know. I won't go too much into details. Maybe someone else can add something.
Hridija wanted to say something, right? And then I think Matt will dispel some of the. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so my reading of it was a little bit different in the sense I was trying to find out why he's talking about the romantic revolt in a way. And initially it felt like with the 18th century or the 17th century or with the starting of Milton, he was tracing out the main tone of the century. But when he came to the topic of Wordsworth and Shelley, he started actively using those elements as if, and then there is a point which actually towards the end, that is when I kind of had an idea what he is trying to do, because he puts these important questions: what are enduring things as distinguished from eternal objects such as color and shape? How are they possible? What is the status and meaning in the universe? It comes to this: what is the status of the enduring stability of the order of nature? And I think these questions and the first, his initial thing about abandoning the notion of simple location, in order to come to this phase, he had to take up the poetic rendering, because somewhere in poetry, he found a unity that was missing in scientific abstractions. And also, he did not want to position, like previously when he was discussing Berkeley, instead of focusing on, putting the locus in the mind, he was trying to transform the idea into prehension. And I felt the whole of it was directed towards him redefining his idea of event that he looks at in like when he says a unity of the event, and he engages with Wordsworth at that moment because he feels like this concrete experience and the description, although in Wordsworth it is limited in the context of nature, he wants to push the boundaries of it and engage in this idea of unity of event in a much grander metaphysical scheme. Because at one point he says that when he already asked those questions about enduring and all that, and instead of going into what he calls the answers of underlying reality, he's appealing to rationality, and he's saying that nature exhibits itself as exemplifying a philosophy of evolution of organisms subject to determinate conditions. And then he talks about the conditions, dimension of space, laws of nature, determinate enduring entities, and he's kind of back to the problem of revolting against the ordinary idea of space, time, and simple location. And I feel like when he says that these conditions, they should exhibit the very nature of the spatiality and temporality should exhibit the arbitrariness of these conditions as the outcome of a wider evolution beyond nature itself. And within nature is but a limited mode. So he's already started off with his idea of the process and how things are getting their meaning out of being a participant in the process itself. And he can associate with that idea because in Wordsworth's poetry, the whole meaning of poetry comes out being in relation with nature and in a kind of unity. And he's just using that, he's kind of translating that in a way, that unity of the event, and he is putting it in a much grander scheme where nature itself is playing a part in the process, and the process kind of and I feel in that scheme that he's kind of imagining also the value of the event and everything that kind of comes into place, because for him the object is not occupying a simple location. The whole reality comes out as an expression of a lot of things merging together, and one like he used the analogy of the monads, were not really similar, but one thing mirroring other thing. And when he says that the electrons may run blindly within the body or outside the body, but when they are not the same thing, because when they are in the body, they are in the process of the body, they are governed by the laws of the body, and therefore there are layers of process, and everything as if gains its meaning through that. Like for me, that was my interpretation, is gaining its meaning through being a participant in that process, and that's where his organism idea comes from. So yeah.
Yeah, Matt.
That's very helpful, Hridija. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, one of the issues is the way he's composed this text, where one minute he's giving a historical account and the next minute he's introducing these totally novel metaphysical categories. And, this is probably the fifth time I've read this text, and it makes more sense the fifth time. having the context, in the last few years, they've been publishing the Whitehead Research Project out of University of Edinburgh has been publishing Whitehead's lecture notes, notes from his students at Harvard for the first few semesters there. And it was during those first few semesters that he was asked to give the lectures that became Science in the Modern World. And so it's almost as though Whitehead was thought he was still lecturing to his students, as if they had all the background of the metaphysics that he was developing with them in class at Harvard. But these lectures weren't delivered at Harvard, and so it's a bit. I would love to see the reaction of the people who were present for these lectures and the sorts of questions that they inevitably had. I don't know any accounts of these lectures, but we do know that when he delivered Process and Reality at the Gifford lectures, that the second or third session, people had really emptied out, and only the people who were gluttons for punishment stayed to try to make sense of it. So Whitehead doesn't seem to do enough for his audience in these lectures, to help us make sense of what he's talking about. But what Hridija just laid out is very helpful in terms of understanding organism. I think it's important to highlight the way that he's developing three key notions that he isn't as clear about until a decade later, when he writes Modes of Thought. But eternal objects are, in Process and Reality, he'll call them, they're definite possibilities, right? And they're real, but they're not actual. And so he wants this category of an eternal object in order to account for what recurs in nature. Matthias is having a hard time here. He wants to know how we can account for recurrences in nature. How is it that, when we look at, the pyramids at Giza today, that we know it's the same pyramid that we saw last time we visited 2 decades ago. Well, Whitehead would point to the recurring eternal objects, or the interfusion of eternal objects that actual pyramid is ingressing or participating in. And eternal objects can be qualitative or quantitative, right? They can be colors, shapes, geometrical relationships to the wider environment. And so Whitehead's bringing this category into his otherwise entirely process ontology in order to account for recurrence, right? Process has to do with occurrence, right? So there's recurrence, there's occurrence, which is where his category of the actual occasion will come in. And an occurrence arises and perishes, right? It's a process that's never the same twice. Recurrences, or eternal objects, allow us to recognize identities that persist. They're not, and a persisting identity would be an occurrence. It's a historical root of occurrences, right? That's repeating with some fidelity the same eternal objects. And so this is the third important notion of endurance, right? So there's occurrences, recurrences, and endurances. And Whitehead's whole scheme is composed out of these three notions in some important sense. And the role of eternal objects, he kind of hints at this. He does not give us enough to make sense of what he's talking about in this chapter on the 19th century, but he talks about eternal objects as qualifying events for one another, such that, he says on, what is this, page 105, the interfusion of events is affected by the aspects of those eternal objects, such as colors, sounds, sense, geometrical characters, which are required for nature and not emergent from it. Such an eternal object will be an ingredient of one event under the guise or aspect of qualifying another event. So this has to do also with Matthias's question about the intrinsic essence of an event or an occasion. Whitehead wants to both preserve a sense of continuity and interrelationship, as well as atomicity and individuality. And so how can he have both? Well, eternal objects that qualify events for one another, they act as the kind of mediator that provides a sense of some room for there to be privacy of experience in individual events, even if just for a moment. As the occasion arises and perishes, there's a novel subjective perspective of all the other events mediated by eternal objects, which in each occasion are fused together in a unique way. But that occasion doesn't last, right? Only endurances last. But each occasion, after it realizes this interfusion of eternal objects that qualify the world for it, it then adds itself to the environment for the next occasion to prehend. So that's kind of the architecture here. And I think this has raised some questions, so I'll pause. Sure.
Yes. Can I just follow up? Just for sake of getting a clearer understanding of it. So you, just a question. Okay. So those eternal objects, where are they exactly? How would you answer that?
Well, it's the same question as where are all the possibilities available to me in this moment?
Mm-hmm.
They don't exist yet.
Mm-hmm.
This is what Whitehead means by the eternal. It's in some way everywhere and nowhere. I mean, it's not in physical space.
It's also not in the subject. That was the question. Is it like in the subject? Is it like a synthesis? Is it objective?
It's an underlying eternal activity, he says.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right.
Matt, how are eternal objects called again in process and reality?
Definite possibilities.
Definite possibilities. And the thing is, so I think, the reason why I think this name is more appropriate and less confusing than the one that is being used here is because if I understand this correctly, like you just said, they're not something that is already, they're not actualities, and they can only, in a certain sense, become part of actualities in specific concrete occurrences. So even though they are eternal, they're not eternal in the sense of pre-existing somewhere, but definite possibilities as those key factors that you will find in each separate event that happens. And it is something that provides for this recurrence that is often. So definite possibilities are the structures or patterns in a certain sense. I'm not using these terms in Whiteheadian sense, but that provide for the recurrences in this process, organic process that you're seeing as a whole. So that's the thing that's the reason why I find this name way more telling and more useful than the eternal objects. Eternal objects really creates a lot of confusion because
sounds very Platonic. It's out there.
Yeah,
these
yeah.
Things, like the geometrical shapes of the elements, and
it definitely brings forth these questions. So it's just a matter of time when you get involved into these questions about, but where do they exist then if they are eternal, and what does that even mean? But if you understand them in that particular way, and also I think that, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong here, this is just how I'm trying to put these things together. The crucial point is they do not exist in and of themselves. They're always parts, aspects of specific occurrences. So it is basically a non-question or a pseudo-question if you ask, but where do they exist? Or, is there like an underlying reality where eternal objects always are? Basically a completely wrong question or a statement to make. Do I understand this correctly?
Yeah, except that, so Whitehead's in a way inverting Plato. his eternal objects are analogous to Platonic forms, except that, unlike Plato, Whitehead's eternal objects are not granted preeminent actuality. They're not actual at all. They're, another term he uses is pure potentials. But to say that, one of the reasons he wants to make reference to eternal objects in his scheme, or to definite possibilities, is he wants to combat what we could call actualism, which is another way of understanding what materialism is. It's the idea that everything has already been actualized, and that change, or evolution, if we want to call it that, is just the rearrangement of already actualized parts. And Whitehead is saying, no, there is potentia in nature, potentials, if you want, that are held in reserve, that have not yet been actualized anywhere in the physical universe, but they could one day be. And so, our language leads us to want to ask, well, where are those unrealized, unactualized potentials? Whitehead would in Persisting Reality, and later in Science in the Modern World, he'll start to articulate his theology. And, you could say, well, unrealized potentials are in the mind of God. I don't know how helpful that is outside the context of his entire scheme. But the point for Whitehead would be that God is an actual entity. And so God, he talks about envisagement of the eternal objects in this chapter. I don't know why he's being so, it's like he's being intentionally obscure here by not introducing what he means. Who's envisaging? Well, I mean, he's talking about the divine. There's a divine envisagement of the realm of possibilities that gives them some value, but they're not, he says, they're not fully actual yet when they're just envisaged. They need to be ingressed into the course of the evolution of the actual universe. But this divine envisagement gives what was just pure possibility, almost akin to chaos, some vector, some sort of minimal teleological tilt or direction towards what is more beautiful. And then, the universe then follows that gradient, as it were, in its ingression of possibilities or eternal objects. So he's not at all clear in this chapter what he's talking about when he refers to the envisagement of, before the envisagement of the realm of eternal objects, these eternal objects are not yet definite, because they're all mixed up. They're all, he says, they have a relational essence, and until they're envisaged and valued, you can't distinguish one from the other. It's just kind of like a chaos of unrealized potential. It's only after the envisagement that they become ordered in some way, in some minimal sense, so that they can be distinguished. Is this helping or making it worse?
It helped a little bit. Actually, you answered one of my questions that popped up, because before, when Sebastjan and you were discussing this, I just can tell you what my sense was, that these eternal objects are definite potentials, right?
Definite possibilities, yeah.
Definite possibilities, that they aren't really actualized yet, but that's how I understood it. They can only be actualized in a certain way. They cannot, it cannot completely change. I can't wake up and instead of the sun, there's a huge broccoli in the sky, Something like this. There's a certain shape that repeats, and these eternal objects make this repetition, these recurrences possible. Now, but when I hear something like this, then I'm always thinking, I'm always being thrown back at myself, that like recurrences, this is something, for me, in my understanding, is something that the human mind is doing. This is not necessarily something you find in the tree itself. I feel, I recognize this tree because I walk past it every day, but it's always a completely new experience and a new tree. That's one of the things that the Buddha said, that's one of our hang-ups. that we think, oh, it's the same thing. It's completely different in like every moment.
Yeah, Whitehead would probably worry that you're being too subjective or idealistic in your interpretation of reality, right? He wants a provisional realism. He wants to grant to the tree its own unity of experience, or at least the cells in the tree, their own unity of experience from moment to moment, reiterating a pattern that does not depend on your mind, right?
Yes,
It's intrinsic to that event.
No, what I mean is more like that I recognize that tree to be that kind of a pattern that is reiterating, that it is an organism, that is a unity.
Whitehead wants to say that there are organisms independent of your organism that reiterate their own unity, right? After all, where does your mind come from? You know?
Yeah, no, what I meant is that I, as a human being, have the capacity to see the tree in that specific way, that this is the same tree, like that has been there yesterday. My dog does not really get it. You know, when I'm gone for 4 hours or for 5 hours or for 20 minutes, it's the same thing. It's like the same occurrence. It's, you know what I mean? There's not this strong sense of enduring objects for all creatures. I don't mean that there is no tree outside of my mind, but that this tree that is out there is the same tree like the one I looked at 20 seconds ago. You know, that judgment, same tree.
Okay, maybe I can add something to this. So two things, Matthias. One thing is you made a move here in what you were saying from basically the initial discussion on eternal objects to occurrences and the question of endurance and identity. So even in the most hardcore, say, Madhyamaka philosophy, Nagarjuna style, even if you have a very, very strong idea of emptiness and interdependence, there are still certain, whatever you would like to call them, patterns that are there and that somehow shape this dynamic structure that you're referring to. So, and these things would be something like colors, shapes, what have you. And if you know, for a certain, if for a moment you forget about these theories or models where, you know, something outside affects your mind and then evokes something, and you just focus, say, on the concrete experience, you realize that these are, in a certain sense, primary ways or primary modes of structuring your experience, regardless of what it is. So, you know, in this sense, I think that the way Whitehead is using this term is precisely this. It's not in the sense that you have color, say color red, existing somewhere, but it is something that whenever a certain occurrence, whenever a certain pattern happens, it usually has certain determinants. And these determinants are basically, in a certain sense, eternal, because they are these recurrences that happen over and over again, in regardless what happens. And they don't necessarily have to have their own independent existence, as you know, you might think of them, but you can think about them as certain conditional structures or what have you. I don't even know, you know, what term to use. And I really like this idea of being a definite possibility, because it kind of anchors, it provides the fundamental shape, or what can give shape to a certain structure, but it's not actual in itself. It can become actual within a specific occurrence. And I think this is really important, because even if you talk about eternal objects, they do become actual only in specific occurrences, which are not eternal, you know? And another thing,
which is also very interesting, this relationship between these three, the recurrences, occurrences, and so on.
Yeah.
And how eternal objects interrelate with events. That was also something very baffling and interesting, because it sounds very much like dependent origination, actually, in some way, but also different many ways, you know.
Yeah, maybe
Anyway,
Matt can
sorry.
say something about this interrelation between recurrence, occurrence, and endurance.
Yeah, well, I mean, the dependent co-origination, I think, is definitely the appropriate comparison, you know, to draw between Madhyamaka and Whitehead. You know, I wish Evan were here to help us with this question too, but Whitehead is really trying to preserve individuality, the possibility of, or the actuality rather, of individuation, as well as the relational essence of not only eternal objects, but also actual occasions. Because, you know, for him the only reason we can do science and talk about laws and apply mathematics to the periodicities of nature is because nature ingresses eternal objects, because nature has these patterns that recur, right? And we can use mathematical notation to capture those recurrences. Whenever someone wants to doubt the significance of the very basic Platonic notion of an idea, you know, the simplest example, I think, shows the necessity of something like an eternal object. You know, two-ness. Two-ness you could say, oh, that's just an abstraction, it's just a word. Well, it has real properties independent of whatever form of notation we might use to capture it. And we can take two actual entities of any sort, two elephants, one elephant and a giraffe, an apple, you know, and a tractor, whatever the two things are, infinitely many possibilities. Nonetheless, the two-ness persists, right? It recurs, and it can recur in an infinite array of actualities, you know. So as a mathematician, Whitehead did not see any way around making reference to these eternal objects. Otherwise, you know, the whole scientific enterprise and our common sense relationship to certain valued and loved people or objects, property, whatever, goes out the window. So he wants to preserve the possibility of mathematical physics and the possibility of our common sense relationship to other people that we love. But here's, you know, the example of a person and a personality, I think, is really relevant for understanding enduring objects of any kind. You know, your tree, for example, it's not the same tree in each moment. You know, it's the actual tree, the physical tree is constantly changing. It's growing, it's decaying, you know, the cells are changing, the seasons are changing, you know, it's always changing. So what recurs in the tree or in a person that you love, who similarly is, you know, growing through in the first 18 or 20 years of life, it's very clear, wow, this person's changing a lot. Same person, but when you're a 3-year-old versus a 14-year-old versus a 21-year-old, I mean, there's obviously not much seems to be staying the same. And yet there's an underlying kind of style or personality or character that persists throughout a person's entire life. What is that character? You know, Whitehead would say that is a complex, our soul, if you want, is a complex eternal object, a set of possibilities that's being inherited from moment to moment of our life history that is similar enough in the pattern that it is reiterating that we can recognize the person. Even if physically, yeah, I mean, our cells are replacing themselves every 7 years, you know, or whatever it is. So it's the form that persists even while the matter is constantly changing. And so, you know, this is the way in which, yeah, it's a fully processual ontology, and yet the problem for the process philosopher becomes, well, how do things stay the same? If the problem for the substance philosopher is how do things change, you know, the process philosopher has this other problem. And eternal objects and the notion of recurrence and repetition of pattern from moment to moment is how Whitehead resolves that issue.
Okay, before I give the word to Izak, just a very brief addition. So what I wanted to say previously, and already Matt said most of it, so I don't really have to do a lot of talking. It refers to the tree example. So Matthias, what you were saying, that's perfectly true. But the thing is, what Whitehead would say, in my opinion, is that what you were describing is basically the capacity of conceptualizing. So you can see the tree as the same if you don't really enter into the concrete experience of that particular tree. So you have the capacity to create abstractions. But in this particular case, what you would have is precisely the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, because you would say, you know, the tree is not changing and I have the capacity to do this. And this is the way you can easily see things. But, you know, Whitehead, and here he's extremely similar and comes very close to phenomenologists. He constantly emphasizes the importance of going back to the concrete experience, to see the tree in its concreteness. And when you see it in that way, you see it as enduring, but not impermanent, not permanent. So there is an impermanence to everything, even to the laws of nature, you know, and he says so in this particular section. So this would be a Whiteheadian answer. You actually get a way more complex picture than that, a way more dynamic picture, where you have certain stabilities, but you have to understand them against the broader context of this interpenetration of basically the whole that is given to you. And this interpenetration is not something that is merely a snapshot now, but has a temporal aspect to it. So yeah, I think that this would be like an additional comment to this. Okay, then Izak.
Yeah, I would like to actually extend this this comparison between Whitehead and phenomenology, because the way I understand eternal objects at the moment is very Husserlian, in that way that I was thinking perhaps it would be fruitful to compare eternal objects with Husserl's formal ontology, because there is some this in Husserl's formal ontology, the way I get it is that you have certain rules, certain ways of the phenomena can combine and they cannot break, right? So, and that's where exactly that's exactly, so that you have the definite possibilities that are not actualized by themselves, but only through things, and you can abstract them from the through things that are actual, but never kind of one could say have a clear intuitive is the wrong word, comprehensive understanding of them. But what I would like to stress perhaps is that there's a different way Husserl talks about these formal structures and Whitehead, namely that Whitehead seems to talk about objects, where I understand he could be talking about some things like axioms or groups of axioms that cannot be broken, and thus describe the formal system. And these axioms are not something that exists by itself, but rather only through the regularities of the occurrences in nature. But in Husserl, it's a bit different. You don't really have, the way I get it, not really axioms. You rather have ideal structures, ideal invariances in certain phenomena. So you cannot really speak about the existence or non-existence of these invariances, whereas with eternal objects, this question could arise. So that perhaps is a problem in vocabulary and expression, but I think it also cuts a bit deeper, especially it shows this different mathematical approach that Husserl and Whitehead, both trained mathematicians, take.
Yeah, maybe just one quick addition with regards to terminology. I think that at least in this particular book, some of the terms that Whitehead uses are a bit unfortunate because they really are almost beg to be misunderstood, or they open themselves up to many misinterpretations. So, for example, also when he declares himself to be an objectivist, like that just creates so much confusion, unnecessarily. But okay, when he explains what he means by that, of course it makes sense. But given the broader horizon, the larger picture, the larger context, where objectivism was precisely understood as falling into the pitfall of postulating these geometrized objects or things as being the prototypical ontological essence or foundation, then this just kind of begs to be misinterpreted. And the same holds true, I think, with regards to these eternal objects. But Izak, what would you say? I mean, what in your view would be these main differences that you say that lie beneath the sheer terminological differences?
I'm not sure. Probably only the kind of the style of thought lends itself to different perspectives. That I would say is the main point, that despite him explaining these weirdly chosen words for his philosophy, they could still be, I mean, to me, Husserl is a bit more advanced in his use of language, or exact in his use of language that way. But I can't really explain it better. It's just
no.
Yeah.
This is something like I had a very similar impression. So I think that where the dialogue between phenomenologists and Whitehead could prove extremely fruitful is precisely so when he talks about we have to go to these things in their concreteness, and there is this concrete experience, and we need to recapture it. Like, this was a really huge deal for phenomenologists. This was the deal for them, and they really did some marvelous stuff here. But this is not Whitehead's primary interest to Whitehead. He wants to go beyond this, and he covers the ground, but then he moves towards other realms and he focuses on those. And I think that Merleau-Ponty, already in Phenomenology of Perception, and then later on in the nature courses, was kind of slowly moving in that direction in a certain way, where he was also opening himself up to some sort of organismic or organic cosmology, not at such a grand scale as Whitehead perhaps, but still. And it is here where Whitehead could probably be an extremely useful interlocutor and could add quite a lot to phenomenological analysis. So some of the things where Whitehead tends to just kind of, some of the things that he tends to skim over, for example, when he talks about this unity of perception somehow mirroring or reflecting the unity of body, that's basically phenomenology of perception right there, right? 500 pages, just this. Let's let's see what we can get out of this and how far this takes us. And there are many these common points where I think that there would be the dialogue would be extremely fruitful. And I agree, Izak. So when it comes to these, so that the precision of terminology, and basically this is something that we touched upon last time, Matt, if you remember, when we were talking about the question of methodology and the German need to be really rigorous about this. They had to do it if they wanted to survive the academic setting in which they were working. So this is also where you could find certain strength in, for example, Husserl. But then he falls into other pitfalls that Whitehead has a way of just dodging, because these are not really issues for him, and he is more free to develop certain things that Husserl wanted to get to, it would seem, but he was struggling to find a way to them because he was developing some form of transcendental idealism, and it was really hard to get out of that, you know, in a specific way. And I think that it was only someone like Merleau-Ponty who managed to find a way out of it by substantially modifying and changing Husserl's phenomenology. Anyway, Timotej, you raised your hand before.
Oh yeah. Can I just comment on this discussion? That
Sure.
I see that the main difference I see between Husserl and Whitehead is exemplified nicely by the disagreement between Matthias and Matt, or Matthias and Whitehead, as I should say, concerning the question where the unity of the phenomenon resides. Is it in your mind, or is it in the thing itself? So this, I think, is an important question, and is a huge difference for me between the two approaches. So maybe, yeah, maybe if someone wants to respond to that, or
I just thought about this exact thing with regards to mathematics, because for Husserl, it seems that it's crucial that the subject gets the structure, the invariance the subject as a mathematician is talking about. Whereas for Whitehead, this, I'm not sure how much the comprehension of the eternal object is involved in our grasping it. That's a weird way of phrasing it, but it seems that for Husserl, this eternal structure is more, it appears more within the subject, and it has this kind of a tinge of intuitive understanding. Like it has this possibility of intuitive understanding. I'm not sure what Whitehead would say about that. So does every eternal object kind of lend itself to intuitive understanding? Or perhaps does it have to be necessarily actualized in a certain event for us then to abstract it? Or that perhaps could be a nice distinction, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, another way to put it, I think is like that. There's a difference between the kinds of unities you can discover with the two methodologies. I think the phenomenological one lends itself to just the kind of cognitive unity and doesn't really allow for other types of unities to be discovered, or at least this is some like shortcoming I would see there. But then again, it's very hard to imagine what kinds of unities, how one would even approach unities alien to your own mind without ceasing to acknowledge the fact that you cannot simply escape your own perspective. So, this relates to my original question, which is, does Whitehead allow for a maybe more rigorous definition of what constitutes individuality, like an individual object, or I think, which is to say the same thing, the event, so the enduring object, like what is actually identical here, or what endures? I think the way we've been speaking for up to this point, it seems like it's something like it stays pretty much the same, like there's some a relation of similarity between its temporal parts, but I think that it's a little more complicated, or at least I think he takes actually a different approach, like where it's very important that the individual enduring object somehow constitutes itself, or is somehow continuously producing itself. So it's a different thing. I think he says somewhere that we have to distinguish between phenomena that that have their source of individuality outside themselves. So I don't know what a good example would be, but like this is perhaps the enduring tree for you, right? So this is a source of individuality outside of the tree. But there's also, like, if you want to get at the actual unity of the tree, you have to figure out what it has to do to maintain its own structure as to counterbalance something, some sort of destructive force exterior to itself. Or this would be maybe a very kind of autopoetic reading, right? But I think that he goes in this direction, or at least a similar interesting direction, where he says like there has to be some sort of top-down causation. So this is one thing I noticed, like the pattern of the whole process has to be somehow involved with the individual elements of the process. So the way like an electron would be different in my body than it would be like in an accelerator somewhere. And then the other thing is that there seems to be some sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Fractal geometry going on, where I didn't understand this part. Maybe someone could explain it to me better. What he means by the individual parts having to exemplify the same pattern as the whole. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
We're all looking at Matt here, so so as to make your job a little bit harder, Matt. So I would just throw into this the question. I think that it relates directly to what Timotej is asking here, because one of the things that does persist, if I understood Whitehead correctly, is the patterns. So what you have to get a pattern, and this pattern basically has to be the pattern of aspects where you have this co-implication. Say, I'm going to use the example of myself as a living body, and then if there happens once you get a co-implication, so the unity of my body coincides or becomes synchronized with the unity of my perceptual experience. So when there is this congruence between the unification of aspects in the body and in the perceptual experience, this is where you get a stable pattern. So this is where the synchronicity happens, and this is then something that can become endurant. Mm-hmm. Did I understand this correctly? Mm-hmm. And then this happens, of course, on different levels of reality. But if we stick, say, to this more lived experience, phenomenological realm, just so as to make things more plastic and understandable, you need to have this type of pattern emerge for you to be able to have something that persists, something that is enduring. So it is the structure. And Timotej, just to add this, here comes the word again, and this would be some sort of a gestalt. So there you have it. But anyway, Matt.
Yeah, that's helpful. This goes back to what Hridija was sharing with us about the source of the order of nature, and Whitehead has to do with really the environmental context, and that the structure of the cosmos is a nested series of organisms, organisms within organisms within organisms. And so in Processing Reality, Whitehead will write about the electromagnetic society as the sort of widest context, the largest environment within which more specific forms of order are sheltered. So the order of our bodies presupposes the order of the electromagnetic society within which we exist. The order of our bodies presupposes the order of the galaxy within which we exist. The order of our bodies presupposes the organization of our solar system, right? And the periodicities of everything from the seasons, the Earth's trajectory around the sun, to the lunar cycles and everything. So all of these, you could say this is Whitehead's theory of like environmentality, if you want. The source of order has to do with the nested series of environments that shelter, is a term he uses. It's kind of a Heideggerian notion of a sheltering of order. And so we're immersed in all these orders, these layers of patterns and periodicities and rhythms. And so all of that layering of these various environments is part of our nature, right? And yet we're not determined by it, because each moment of our experience is new, and we're contributing back to the environment. After all, the environment is made of other organisms, right, at different scales. So there's no fixed environment in Whitehead's scheme, just there's no fixed order in Whitehead's scheme. Everything is co-evolving. And yet, the influence that we as human beings can have over the electromagnetic society is pretty minuscule, at least at this point. We'll see the further evolution of technology. But at this point, many of these enveloping environments have established an order and have established habits that we call laws of physics that we're not going to be able to change. And yet, a billion years from now, Whitehead says we can't even begin to predict what the universe might look like because of the wide-scale evolution that's unfolding. This question of the unity of experience, and like the contrast with Husserl and a more idealistic point of view, is an important one. I think, in Whitehead, unity is something that we have to establish on aesthetic grounds, not logical grounds. The unity of an organism has to do with, it's not like an on-off switch. It has to do with the importance of the values that are realized by that event, by that occasion. So Whitehead will talk about primate organisms, which he says, electrons, hydrogen nuclei, these seem to be, in his day, these were some of the smallest entities that physics had yet differentiated. Now we know about quarks and muons and all these other things. Whitehead thought it was unlikely that there would be an infinite regress in nature. He doesn't rule it out, but he thinks there's some bottom level. And in his scheme, the most primary organism would be that which doesn't have smaller organisms within it, but rather he says something like, the only thing that these smallest organisms can relate to would be eternal objects, right? There's no smaller organism there. And so at that minuscule level of nature, there's a fusion of possibilities that gives rise to the first actuality. That's kind of what he leaves us with. And he talks about the organic structure of the atomic realm. And then he talks about this period in this phase in the scaling up of nature where there's just aggregates and we get statistical laws, the way that throngs of particles behave, and we start to lose that organic unity that doesn't reemerge, he says, until cellular life evolves. And then you get, again, the emergence of these unities, these units of value, units of emergent value, he says. And so again, this is an aesthetic thing, that the experience that is realized in these units of emergent value is carrying certain importance, aesthetic importance, that allows us to say it qualifies as a new individual. Whereas, a cloud of hydrogen gas is not an individual. Why? Because it's not, in Whitehead's view, realizing something of aesthetic importance as a unit, whereas a cell is, right? An animal is at a higher level of organization, multicellular, but yet a new unity is discovered by the architecture, the body plan of an organism, a multicellular organism. And so this is different from, Husserl's notion of unity, obviously, in that it's objective in Whitehead's sense of that term. It's something that takes place outside the mind of the mathematician in the natural world as a result of an aesthetic achievement by an organism, right? And this doesn't require a human subject in order to recognize it or name it as such. We are ourselves an example of this natural process of unification as the result of the realization of aesthetic value or importance of some kind. And I think this, Whitehead's making aesthetics first philosophy. And what you know, and if you look at Kant's philosophy, the third critique of teleological judgment, and the understanding of beauty, Whitehead is in a way taking the Kantian philosophy and getting rid of the first two critiques and just expanding upon the third critique and saying this is what really Kant should have been focused on. You know, beauty not just as a subjective something that human beings attribute subjectively to certain forms in nature, but rather beauty as something that nature itself is seeking to realize, you know, so it's a more objective version of Kant, but building on the critique of judgment in some ways. And I think once we make that shift into an aesthetic ontology, a lot of the pieces here start to fall into place. It's a different set of criteria for determining, say, what a unity is, what an organism is, what evolution is, you know.
Matt, can I?
Yeah.
Did you want to continue?
No, I think that's what I wanted to share. Go ahead.
One thing that also Whitehead mentions that I found so interesting when he talks about value, and he connects value with limit, like delimitation. And this I find extremely interesting because in a certain sense, it ties in with what Timotej was saying, where you basically have to have a certain something that is able to constitute and maintain a limit, a boundary. And this is what is related to value. So value to appear, there has to be a delimitation. And I was reminded of Canguilhem's idea of living beings being, so what characterizes living beings is this polarity. So that it matters for the living beings in what state they are. And this is precisely their ability to delimit themselves. So there is a certain normativity, which he says, which Canguilhem says is inherent to living beings. And Klesner, who was also mentioned, basically puts the idea of having a boundary as that which characterizes living beings. So the ability to not only have a boundary as something that is there, but is actually something that in a certain sense you are able to have and own and maintain. And this is closely related again to this polarity and normativity and thus value. So this idea of having the capacity to delimit. So I think that one of the interesting questions here would also be so with in relation to what we were talking about before is how does a delimitation get constituted? And this is something that Timotej brought up when we were having a talk, one of the Varela talks, because there seems to be a certain tension, for example, when Varela talks about how you go about recognizing a living being, because he talks sometimes as if it was the observer who describes and does the limits. But on the other hand, there is a certain recursivity, he says, like certain circularity that is inherent to the living organisms. And if you take this seriously, they do posit themselves. So it is them who posit themselves in the sense of delimiting themselves. I don't know, it's just an interesting confluence of various ideas that seem to be falling together. And for the past 1 year or so, I've been really intrigued about this question of describing and delimiting. So, you know, how the limitation comes to be. I don't know, Matthias and Hridija, you guys.
I just wanted to follow up maybe also on some things that you mentioned now and previously, Sebastjan. So like you said, in Nagarjuna and in all the Madhyamakas, you find this way how you posit the conventional. And one part is the causal connections of things. And things have their own causal connections, conventionally speaking. And it sounds very much like how Whitehead explains it, but Whitehead has very different and more nuanced language for it, because it's way more important, maybe in our time, to be very precise to talk about these things. And another one is, so that's one part, like things are dependently originated based on their causal connectivity, how they are in themselves causally related. And then the next level is the relationship between parts and wholes, that wholes are always related on their parts. Parts themselves have parts and form wholes. And for Buddhists, that would be an infinite regress. It would be bottomless, you know, that whole part relationship goes down till there's nothing graspable anymore, basically. And then the third one is very much what you talked about right now. This weird, like, is the object giving the living object giving itself the boundary, or is it a certain kind of consciousness capable of doing that, of picking out these kinds of gestalts that seem to be enduring? And that's the third and most subtle level of dependent origination for Buddhists. They would say what happens here has very much to do with the consciousness as well. It has, in some way, like to draw the line, that's something that Marikpa is doing. Avidya, right? Like not knowing. It's something that we do in a certain sense. And
yeah.
And I mean, like I'm not yet fully on board with Whitehead on these points. Also, I have to say, and it's very interesting, but I don't know. I'm not sure.
You know, Matthias, I think that here again, I would say that with Whitehead, it's basically a continuous. In a certain sense, I'm going to use the phrase he never uses, I think, but it's a bit of a dialectical process where, of course, it's important that you have this element of consciousness or experience that goes all the way down, because this is what allows for actualization to happen and also to change, to enter the whole, you know, the whole thing, I think. So, you know, what I said before, if you want to have a certain pattern that becomes endurant, what has to happen is a certain synchronization. And now if you go way back, you see that this is something that has been continually happening. Like these pattern formations were a very dynamic thing. They are not, so when the consciousness in the narrow sense of the term, I'm not sure whether I'm speaking for Whitehead now, I'm just kind of reflecting on my own. This brings another segment to the whole story. You know, of course it's important, but it's not crucial. It is not determinative. It is not determinative. And if you were to claim that it is, I would claim that you are misinterpreting Nagarjuna and that you're falling into the Yogacara camp. You know, so you also have
which point exactly you mean?
So if you would be claiming that it is consciousness that constitutes or determines, because you're very close to consciousness only then.
No.
And if you're willing to say that consciousness, okay,
What
this
I'm
is
saying
the case,
is it's one part of the dependent origination that a thing appears as if it's out there and is recurring, and this or that thing, one aspect of that is not just the causal continuity of the thing. It's not just the dependence of the parts and whole, these relationships in the thing. One other aspect is the kind of consciousness that this body is in, you know, connected to, or
yeah, okay,
co-arising, you know. That's also a part in picking it out. You cannot just say no, that it's not a part.
This I agree
That's
with.
why
And
it
this,
is empty. That's why the consciousness is empty and the thing is empty.
but this is what I think that Whitehead is getting at when he says that, for example, the unity
It
of
feels
my,
like that.
yeah, but
Yeah.
look, when he talks about there's a unity of my body and the unity of my perceptual field, which is basically open onto the world, they are kind of co-implicatory, which means that I have to unify the aspects of the world, but the world unifies the aspects of me. So this has to happen in order for you to have a stable pattern. And it is the pattern that is enduring. This is very important, I think. You know, so you have these two aspects. I think that there are a lot of interesting parallels here with basically Madhyamaka, very extremely interesting parallels. But anyway, so as not to go on with this too long, Hridija wanted to say something, and then Timotej.
Yeah, I mean, I was firstly thinking about the parallels with Nagarjuna and Madhyamaka, and I kind of find the discrepancies with the meanings associated about with the word mind or consciousness, because here in Whitehead he's also the victim of history of ideas and dealing with Cartesian dualism, and I feel like for Whitehead he is struggling with the language because he's also trying to work on the bifurcation of the nature of reality, bifurcation of reality, and therefore I think it's more complex than finding a direct analogy with the idea of self or mind, or how causality works in the Eastern counterparts, because that problem is not there. That problem in that scripture, in that literature, is absent. And I mean, that's where I get a little confused when the analogy is happening in some ways. But also with the, I wanted to comment on the what you said about value, and value, like where Whitehead once mentions that, I think mentions something like realization. What did you say? Realization, therefore, is in itself the attainment of value, and takes a bird eye view on the objective ordering of the cosmos. And instead of the common notion of value, I think what it just means could be just a simple manifestation of something in its particular order of existence, in whatever way or order it is existing. And that is the limitation, that it is that and nothing else. So it's like a bird eye view of the thing. It's not really subjective, it's completely objective, that the very existence of something as it is and not as something else is its value and is its intrinsic nature, in a way, and that itself is a limitation, because it is somehow it is ordered by the past experiences, the past causalities and other factors, and that novelty of the moment itself brings out that value. So
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think that, you know, in order for you to be able to call it value, because you have to then explain what differentiates this particular, say, fundamental structure from a certain structure that you might find in a mechanistic point of view. And according to Whitehead, there is a value aspect to it. And this is why I said that, for example, the idea of polarity that Canguilhem introduces, where you have this certain minimal directedness of sorts, or a minimal pull or a minimal intentionality towards something. So once you have a certain identity, in order for it to be an identity, it has to delimit itself in a way that makes it, you know, that its interactions with everything else are no longer neutral. There is a certain polarity, which means that there is a certain tension, certain normativity, and therefore also meaning. And this meaning, according to Whitehead, if I understand him correctly, is not necessarily on the conceptual or a cognitive level at the most fundamental level, even in the domain of experience, but it is of aesthetic nature. So there is an aesthetic nature that is closely related to this value or normativity, if I use Canguilhem's word in a very, very different way. He would disagree with me, with all of us here, I think. But it is helpful for me to conceptualize it in this particular way. So, you know, of course you can say what you just said, but it is not enough, because for Whitehead, it's really important that this is value, that this is something that is a unity of value, so that if you have an occurrence, that there is an element of value happening here, and that the pattern is value. It has to be not just, you know, this is something that provides it with a unity, after all. Yeah, Timotej.
Yeah, so I have something very related. I wanted to say that I partly agree with Matthias, actually, regarding like not being able to dissociate this from acts of consciousness, or maybe a better word for me would be intelligence. But I would, at least if you imagine this as a kind of an autopoietic unity, then I would argue that you need a certain level of intelligence, or an activist would call this sense making, or but anyway, something that entails an active comparison between two states: the state you are in and the state in which you want to be. So this is a level of discrimination that introduces the kind of normativity needed for a prolonged sustaining of a unity. So, and this is something different. It's interesting when you compare this to a notion like polarity that has different connotations for me. Like I think I wouldn't be able to imagine an individualized system maintaining itself just in virtue of it being polarized. This is just something that drives you forward, not something that enables you to maintain a stable set of states, right? So this is an interesting difference. And here I think it's very interesting that Whitehead always uses the phrase value for itself. So he does imply some sort of individuation, not just value in the sense of a drive or wanting to attain something. And something else I wanted to add is that it's very interesting when you compare this to Simondon's account. Yeah, what I wanted also to say is that so in this regard, I can easily, or at least I can imagine biological organisms doing what Whitehead wants to say, but it's very difficult for me to appreciate this on the level of, like, let's say, molecules or atoms or any kind of physical phenomena. And in this sense, it's interesting to compare this to Simondon, who has this notion of individuation, which he also uses in terms, like he has this idea that crystals or solid states have a way of maintaining boundary. And interestingly, he connects this to the notion of polarity. So electrical polarity actually is for him the source of, the primal source of normativity, which I cannot expound, but I found it really interesting. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I'm gonna have to run here in a few minutes, you guys, but this is we're definitely we've opened up the cans of worms and they're squiggling on the table. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, maybe we can call it quits, huh? It's been 2 hours, so unless somebody else has any further short comments or questions, comments preferably. No?
well, just the one thing to say, that while we're trying to sort of highlight these differences between transcendental idealist approach and Whitehead's organic realist approach, at the end of the day, they end up in a similar place. Whitehead himself says in the first few pages of Process and Reality that in the final interpretation, his process philosophy is not all that different than absolute idealism. It's just a matter of the methodology deployed and sort of how you get there. And of course, some of the details are different. But Whitehead really does want to, as I said in the chat, there's so much that is Buddhist in his approach, but there's also, he really wants to emphasize that form is where all the value is. Right? Yes, all forms are empty of intrinsic nature, and yet it's also in the forms that you find the importance and the meaning and significance of reality. And so there's not as much of that, I guess it's a soteriological sense of, if only we could realize everything is empty, we'd stop suffering. Whitehead's not as interested in stopping suffering. Actually, for him, the highest aim of the universe is tragedy, the realization of tragic beauty. That's the teleology of all of cosmic evolution for him. So that's quite different from the Buddhist orientation, unless you start to bring in the Bodhisattva's vow, and you know, there are ways of kind of massaging it. But anyways, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, it was a great discussion.
No, for
I'm
sure.
so-
Yeah.
It's firing me up. I want more. And
Okay,
one
so
other big difference is also, I think, the Buddhists, they don't do math. Not really.
they
You know,
do,
it's not
they
a
do
big
logics.
thing.
They do logics.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a
They do.
Buddhist logics thing.
Mm.
So in 2 weeks, the next session is in 2 weeks. The presenter is, I think, Izak. Izak, are you there to confirm this?
Yes,
Okay. Okay, and then after that we have okay, an empty slot of sorts. So Timotej is a backup, but he said that he would be very grateful if somebody else would be willing to jump in. So please consider doing that. And then after that we have Matt. And then the last presentation is by Adnan, I think. Yeah, okay, so in 4 weeks, I think it's in 4 weeks, you can check out the Excel sheet that is always attached to the email. There's an empty slot, so if anybody would be willing to jump in, that would be very nice. If not, Timotej will do the presentation, but he has something else going on, so he would appreciate if somebody else would take the bullet, so to speak. Anyway, yeah. It was nice seeing you all. Thanks for being here. See you in 2 weeks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.